Chapter 7 of Prophets, Priests and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7 The Kaiser. When I think of the Kaiser, I think of a bright May morning in Potsdam. It is the spring parade, and across from where we are gathered under the windows of the old palace, the household troops are drawn up on the great parade ground, their helmets and banners and lances all astir in the jolly sunshine. Officers gallop hither and thither, shouting their commands. Regiments form and reform. Swords flash out and flash back again. A noble background of trees frames the gay picture with cool green foliage. There is a sudden stillness. The closely serried ranks are rigid and moveless. The shouts of command are silenced. The Kaiser! He comes slowly up the parade ground on his great white charger, helmet and eagle flashing in the sunlight, sitting his horse as if he lived in the saddle, his face turned to his men as he passes by. "Morgen, meine Kinder!" his salutation rings out at intervals in the clear morning air, and back from the ranks in chorus comes the response, "Morgen, Majestät!" And as he rides on, master of 1,000,000 men, the most powerful figure in Europe, reviewing his troops on the peaceful parade ground at Potsdam, one wonders whether the day will ever come when he will ride down those ranks on another errand, and when that cheerful response of the soldiers will have in it the ancient ring of doom, Te morituri salutamus. For answer, let us look at this challenging figure on the white charger. What is he? What has he done? The Kaiser is easily the foremost man in Europe. He is a king after Charles I's own heart, a king indeed, the last that is left, the residuary legatee of the divine right. The divinity of the Tsar vanished in the tumult of Red Sunday. He is an autocrat, struggling with an infuriated people. His power frankly rests on physical force. But the Kaiser is still able to associate Providence with his rule, still invokes the Almighty as the witness of his authority. Democracy, which has devoured all the rest, thunders at the base of his throne. It leaps higher and ever higher. One day there will come a wave that will submerge all, and divine right will have passed forever from kings to peoples. Then the Kaiser will rule by consent, like our own monarch, or... Meanwhile he stands facing the modern world, the symbol of medievalism in the heart of the 20th century. The cause for which he fights could have no more worthy protagonist. He is every inch a king. Divest him of his office, and he would still be one of the half-dozen most considerable men in his empire. When the British editors visited Germany, they are brought into intimate contact with all the leaders of action and thought in the country, and I believe it is true to say that the Kaiser left the sharpest and most vivid personal impression on the mind. It was the impression of enormous energy and mental alertness, of power, wayward and uncertain, but fused with a spark of genius, of a temperament of high nervous force, quickly responsive to every emotional appeal. His laugh is as careless as a boy's, but you feel that it is laughter that may turn to lightning at a word. The world distrusts the artistic temperament in affairs. It prefers the stolid man who thinks slowly and securely and acts with deliberation. It likes a man whose mental processes it can follow and understand, a man of the type of the late Duke of Devonshire, solid, substantial, and not the least bit clever. There is the root of the disquiet with which the Kaiser has been regarded for 20 years. He is a man of moods and impulses, an artist to his fingertips, astonishingly versatile, restless and unnerving. He keeps his audience in a state of tense expectation. Any moment, it feels, a spark from this incandescent personality may drop into the powder magazine. He is full of dramatic surprises, of sudden and shattering entrances, of mysterious exits. He moves amidst alarums and excursions, and wherever he goes the limelight follows him. He journeys to Tangier, and Europe trembles with the thunder of his tread. He sails away into Arctic seas on a summer cruise, and his astonishing sermons to his men echo round the world. He comes back and makes our flesh creep with his pictured visions of the Yellow Peril. He writes an opera and is off to the Rhine to wind his horn. He addresses public meetings like a party politician and with the authority of a prophet, and he denounces the Socialists like a Property Defence League orator. No man in history ever had a more godlike vision of himself than he has. His cloud of dignity is held from falling by the visible hand of the Almighty. I regard my whole position, he tells the representatives of Brandenburg, as given to me direct from heaven, and that I have been called by the Highest to do his work. Sometimes, indeed, even the Almighty is subordinate. Suprema lex regis voluntas, he writes in the Golden Book of Munich. He declares his omnipotence with a childish egoism that would be ludicrous if it were not so sincere. He takes nothing for granted, does not, like Montaigne, let his chateau speak for him. My church, of which I am summus episcopus, he says in lecturing the office-bearers on their duties. And again, there is only one master in this country, that am I. Who opposes me I shall crush to pieces. It is like the vain prattle of an unschooled boy. His uncle dwells aloof from politics. The Kaiser comes down into the arena like a stump orator. To me, he said in 1889, every Social Democrat is synonymous with enemy of the nation and of the fatherland. This is the largest party in the land, a party that commands 3.5 million votes. And years have not taught him discretion. At Breslau, not long ago, in addressing a deputation of working men, he said, "For years you and your brothers in Germany have allowed yourselves to be kept by Socialist agitators under the delusion that if you do not belong to their party you will not be in a position to obtain a hearing for your legitimate interests. That is a downright lie. With such men you cannot, you dare not, as men who love honour, have anything more to do. You cannot, you dare not let yourselves be guided by them any longer." Diplomacy and restraint, it will be seen, are not among his varied gifts in dealing with his people. Sometimes his vaulting ambition o'erleaps itself. It was his dearest wish to be not German Emperor, but Emperor of Germany, and crowned as such. He designed all the splendours of the ceremony, taking Charlemagne as his prototype. But he found there were limits to the complaisance of the other German rulers and peoples, always intensely jealous of the dominance of Prussia and its king. They would not yield, and he remains today the uncrowned German Emperor, not the crowned Emperor of Germany. It is the fly in the imperial ointment, the supreme disappointment of his career. Bismarck had cared only for the substance and not for the shadow when he consented to the limited title of the ruler of the new empire. The subject was being discussed in his presence at the time of the Union. Some were for German Emperor and some for Emperor of Germany. "Does anyone know the Latin word for sausage?" asked Bismarck, using that homely imagery of his. "Farcimentum," said one. "Farcimen," said another. "Farcimentum or farcimen, it is all the same to me," said Bismarck. Sausage was sausage, whatever the name. He had welded Germany and was indifferent to titles. The Kaiser's view of his divine function extends to every phase of life. There is nothing in which he cannot instruct his people. He will snatch the baton from the incompetent conductor and show him how to lead the orchestra, the brush from the incompetent artist and show him how to paint. He can cook a dinner as skilfully as he can preach a sermon, draw a cartoon, write an opera, play the piano, or talk in 5 languages. And who will forget his amazing letter to Admiral Hallman on the higher criticism in reply to Professor Delitzsch? Even trade does not escape him, and the famous pottery works which he has founded and carries on at Gardiner are a source of delighted labour to him. He has established a shop in Berlin to dispose of his wares, and he will take an order on the cuff of his shirt-sleeve with the promptness of a commercial traveller. But all this is the recreation of his strenuous life. His serious task is to make Germany great. The ambition with which he set out was to create a navy. He has done it. Frederick taught Germany to march. He has taught it to swim. Navigare necesse est, vivere non est necesse. And if he regards his people as children, he is anxious that they should be efficient children. His views on education are entirely radical and not very sympathetic towards the meticulous and exact scholarship which is Germany's contribution to the modern world. "Our business is to educate young Germans, not young Greeks and Romans," he says. He approves of Homer, that glorious man about whom I have always been enthusiastic, and of Cicero and Demosthenes, whose speeches must have filled everyone with delight. But he has no sympathy with grammatical and fanatical philologists, who waste their own time and the time of students over grammatical hair-splitting. Away with his tomfoolery! War to the knife against such teaching. He will have no rival near the throne. Does the mighty figure of Bismarck tower to the heavens and divide the crown? Then Bismarck must go back to his fields and woodlands at Friedrichsruhe. He will brook no interference, tolerate no counsel. He is here to command, not to take advice. And yet the revelations of the Moltke-Harden trial have shown that the most omnipotent of emperors is subject to the subtlest and most insidious of influences. Men used to talk of him in whispers in Germany, or they did not talk of him at all, for lèse-majesté was the cardinal sin, and walls had ears and streets had spies. But that is changed. Criticism is abroad, and the doctrine of divinity has received several checks which the Kaiser has had the wisdom to acknowledge. But he will never be a popular figure. The old emperor, his never-to-be-forgotten grandfather, was loved. There at the palace in Berlin they show you the window at which he used to sit in the mornings to see and be seen by the crowd, an old familiar figure, human and paternal, the father of his people. His grandson is aloof and remote. He dwells on Olympus and sends his thunderbolts hurtling over the astonished people. But though he does not ask for affection, he commands respect. His people admire his character. They are proud of his clean, vigorous life, of his devotion to his family, and of his high sense of duty to the fatherland. His life is a drama that never grows humdrum. It keeps them intellectually on the move. What will happen next with this amazing man? No one can be more fascinating. His smile is irresistible. But if you are a bore, or if you are out of favour, his look runs you through like a sword. His questions are rapped out like musket shots. He does not listen to your answers, but plays with his dogs. He is not aware of you. His actions are swift and unexpected. The spur of the moment drives him. It was a momentary irritation with Lord Salisbury that was the origin of the Kruger telegram, perhaps the most momentous and disastrous incident in the history of Europe in our time, for it was the seed of all the bitterness of after years. The telegram form, indeed, is the symbol of his mental processes. He will become a guest at your board at an hour's notice, and be the most light-hearted boy at the table. When he entertained the editors at luncheon at the Orangerie at Sans Souci, he said nothing about seeing them. The first intimation they had was the vision, as they sat taking their coffee in the sunshine, of the Kaiser riding up the steep winding paths from the palace below, and in 2 minutes he was among them, talking of the London docks and the Hamburg docks, of the Lake District and Lord Lonsdale, with pleasant frankness and easy idiomatic English. Then, with a bright word of welcome to his country and his house, and with 3 salutes, a special mark of imperial approval, he rode away. Impulsive, imperious, dramatic, a militarist from his cradle, a statesman trained in the indirect, crooked ways of Bismarck, governed by one passion, the passion to make his land great and powerful, how can we cast his horoscope? Is he a menace or a safeguard? Let his past be his witness. For 20 years he has had the peace of Europe in his keeping, and for 20 years not a German soldier has fallen in war. "We are a military people," said a minister to me in Berlin, "but we are not a warlike people. It is you who are warlike without being military." And so we may say of the Kaiser. He is a militarist, but he is not a warrior. "There will be no war without grave cause while the Kaiser is on the throne," said the politician I have quoted. He is distrusted by the warlike party, and remember that Germany has a considerable school of thinkers who believe in war philosophically as a national purgative. They believe he is timid. But the truth is he wants peace because it is his own and the nation's chief interest. Remember how he disappointed expectation when he came to the throne. Germany was on the verge of war with France and Russia combined, and Europe saw the accession of the youthful Kaiser, so hot-headed and impulsive, with fearful expectation. Here was a new Napoleon, filled with dreams of glory, armed with the most gigantic military weapon in history. And his first official words were words of peace. His first act to visit the European courts, returning with the message, "I believe that, with the help of God, I have succeeded in ensuring the peace of the world for many years to come." Set this and the record of his reign against those sudden ebullitions that seem so alarming, but are really only sound and fury, signifying nothing. He keeps his powder dry and his armour bright, but he stands for peace, peace armed to the teeth, it is true, peace with the mailed fist, but peace nevertheless. And so, as one watches him riding down the ranks at Potsdam in the bright sunshine, hears the morning greeting rapped out in sharp staccato, and sees his salute to the Empress watching the parade from the windows of the old palace, one feels confidence displacing distrust, and discerns beneath all this rattle of drums and love of the drama of government an undercurrent of purpose, making, it is true, for the aggrandizement of Germany, but making also for the peace of the world. If he fails in his policy of peace, it will be because of the incurable air of falsity that is the besetting vice of German policy, a policy which has been well described by the Frankfurter Zeitung as incalculable, untrustworthy, and disturbing. It is a policy that always wears a mask, and a mask is a menace. Its words are smooth, but its acts are sinister, and seem to have no relation to the words. It is a policy of cunning rather than of candour. It is incident to a government which is personal and secret, and Germany will not cease to be a disturbing element in world politics until the Kaiser has stepped down from his medieval throne and derives his power from a free and self-governing people. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Sir Edward Grey. If one were asked to say whose word carried the most weight in Parliament today, there could, I think, be only one answer. Whether in office or out of office, whether to friend or foe, Sir Edward Grey is intrinsically the weightiest speaker of his time. When he sits down in the House of Commons, it is as though discussion has ceased. Other men speak from the bar. He speaks from the bench. He does not argue. He delivers a judgment. There is no appeal, and no one asks for an appeal. I remember a curious instance of this note of final authority. It was during the time when Mr. Balfour was holding his ministry together by his arts of evasion and agility. The attack was hot and furious, the temper of the House high and passionate. But it seemed that nothing could tear away the veil of falsity behind which Mr. Balfour concealed his evolutions. Late at night Sir Edward Grey rose. It was as though a visitor from another planet had invaded the House. He spoke briefly, quietly, without heat and without emotion. But it was as if the House had listened to a rebuke that was almost a sentence. Mr. Balfour was silenced. There seemed nothing to do but to go home. If we seek for the source of this authority, we are struck, first, by the relative poverty of his equipment. There are many brilliant men in the House of Commons. Sir Edward Grey is not one of them. The stuff of his speech is plain to the point of homeliness. His thought is ordinary, almost conventional. He never coins a phrase that sticks, nor wears a rhetorical flower in his buttonhole. He has none of the arts of popular appeal. I remember him addressing a great provincial audience after the Fashoda crisis. It was an audience that had assembled to have its political partisanship stimulated. It sat in stony silence for an hour while Sir Edward told the story of Fashoda, about which the audience obviously did not care a rap, and praised Mr. Wyndham and the Conservatives for their conduct during the crisis. When he sat down, the temperature of the meeting had fallen below freezing point, and only the fulminations of a local orator, whose poverty of aspirates was balanced by the richness of his enthusiasm, saved the occasion from utter failure. He is remarkable neither for learning nor ambition. His knowledge is limited, and his insularity a tradition. He never leaves the shores of England, and is reputed to have little French. He contrasts almost startlingly, to take an example, with Sir Charles Dilke, who is a citizen of the world, has been everywhere, knows everything, and is like a well-kept office where you will find the minutest detail pigeon-holed for immediate reference. Nor has he the industry that corrects so many deficiencies in others. His love of leisure is as notorious as his love of tennis and of fishing. It is significant that the only book he has written is on the art of fly fishing. He has no passion for politics. He seems a casual figure in the field of affairs, a spectator who is a little bored by its feverish activities and idle talk. You feel that he may leave it at any moment and be discovered at home, making trout flies. It is this aloofness from life that is the key to his unique position. He comes into affairs, as it were, from the outside, detached, unimpassioned, bringing his own atmosphere with him. He has the large serenity of one who is at home in his own mind, draws his water from his own well, has that inward light that makes the path before him always bright. The passions of men, the cries of the market-place, the frenzy of the conflict, do not touch him. He dwells outside them in a certain grave isolation. It is not that he is cold. His philosophy is not that of the Stoic, steeled to endurance of an implacable fate. It is rather the philosophy of the mind that feeds on a wise passiveness, and finds in that food those large reserves of power that give his words their peculiar weight, and his actions their stamp of authority. There is a certain spaciousness and simplicity in his character that communicate a sense of abiding purpose to politics. He sees the landscape, as it were, from an elevation, and takes in its features in broad masses. His view of the forest is not obscured by the trees. There are richer minds in politics, more eager minds, more fertile minds, but there is no mind so secure and self-contained, so indifferent to external impulse, so firmly rooted in itself. His influence is not unlike that exercised by the late Duke of Devonshire. It is the influence of a character of absolute purity of motive and of unyielding independence of thought. It is the influence of one to whom the world can offer no bribe. There is nothing in its gift that he wants, neither power nor praise nor wealth. His mind to him a kingdom is, and in that kingdom he finds full content. In that kingdom, too, it is nature and not man which is his constant companion. He is wholly indifferent to society, and leaves the social and festive functions of his office to others, while he escapes to the quiet of that country cottage where, before his tragic bereavement, he lived with his wife the simple life he loves, and where now he is happy in the companionship of natural things. His passion for nature is indeed the keynote of his character. A colleague of his in the Cabinet told me an incident illustrating this rich and wholesome enthusiasm. The session of a certain year had been an unconscionable time a-dying, and Sir Edward, yearning for the country, had been held an unwilling captive to the dusty ways of Westminster. At last he escaped, took the train to Northumberland, and reached his home at Falladon in the late evening. And, full of the joy of his recovered liberty, he ascended to the roof of his house and spent the night amid the silence that is in the starry sky, the peace that is among the lonely hills, until the dawn came up over the North Sea that beats hard by against the rock-bound coast. It follows almost naturally that his one literary enthusiasm is for him who took men out into the light of things where nature is the teacher. "I spent last night with Gray," said a friend of his to me, "and we talked of nothing but Wordsworth." It is significant, too, that at a dinner of a literary club on one occasion, the three authors he referred to as those light-hearted and happy writers who give us recreation when we are tired and have lost resource in ourselves were Isaac Walton, Gilbert White, and Thomas Love Peacock. Show me a man's books, and I will tell you his character. He has the unhasting mind of the countryside. He never flashes out in any sudden flame of enthusiasm. He is slow to move, but he is slower still to speak. The ball has reached the mark before you hear the report. He is deaf alike to the prayers of his friends and the menaces of foes. He goes his own way, takes his own time, declines to make any veiled promises in order to secure suspense of judgment. They say. What say they? Let them say. When the thing is done, he will speak. Till then, let the heathen furiously rage together. This reticence, so trying to the eager mind, invests him with a certain cloud of power that speech would dissipate. He is a hidden and implacable purpose. Sometimes that purpose, when disclosed, has the shock of dramatic surprise. For 2 years the friends of Macedonia had thundered at his gate in vain. He gave them no encouragement, was cold, and apparently indifferent. Then, one night, following a fierce onslaught by Mr. Masterman, which he waved aside without anger, almost with gentleness, he announced a policy which suddenly changed the whole situation, and revealed him taking a brave and high line with the powers in the cause of a desolated people. Less defensible was the muzzle he imposed on the House in the midst of the Denshawi shame. He represented the situation as too critical for discussion, but the truth, subsequently revealed, leaves one at a loss to understand that demand for silence from one whose tendency is to understate the facts. For it is clear that there was never any real peril. But indeed the whole of that dark story, with Sir Edward's defence of the officials, followed by the sudden resignation of Lord Cromer, and the belated release of the wronged villagers who had escaped the scaffold, is obscure and disquieting. Not less typical of his attitude of reserve towards Parliament was his silence as to the Russian agreement, which was never allowed to be discussed, and which, with apparently studied scorn, was published a few days after Parliament had risen. Sir Edward Grey's view of foreign affairs, indeed, is that it is a close bureaucratic preserve into which he will allow no impertinent trespassers. It is outside the field of democracy. There is no right-of-way through his woods, and he is the keeper with a gun. This is a just view so far as the conduct of delicate negotiations is concerned, but it is assailable when applied to the spirit of national policy. Even Prince Bülow in bureaucratic Germany seeks the endorsement of Parliament, to which he explains his policy at least with seeming frankness. But in democratic England the foreign minister is silent as the Sphinx, looking out over the desert of Parliament into infinity. Others abide our question, thou art free. We ask and ask, thou smilest and art still. Sir Edward is indeed the least democratic, as he is the least demonstrative, of men. He belongs more than any man today to the great Whig tradition, the Whig tradition touched by the strong personality of Bishop Creighton, who was his tutor when that great man held a parsonage in Northumberland, and by the passionless spirit of the Balliol of Jowett. He distrusts the irresponsible waywardness of public opinion, with its quick emotions and passionate transitions. The public, the public! How many fools does it take to make the public? He seems to say with a statesman of an earlier time. And yet perhaps that is unjust, for there is no trace of bitterness in him, and his patrician view is free from the taint of contempt or the airs of the superior person. It sits on him naturally. He is to the manner born. He takes his place at the high table without pushing and without challenge. He is there by a sort of royal authority, unconscious of itself, but imaged in the bold sculpture of the face, the steady eye, and the governing nose. The unrivalled confidence which he commands in the country is not wholly shared by those who regard England as the banner-bearer in the cause of human liberty. For this cause he has done little. His policy is governed by a fixed idea, the idea that peace must be preserved by having friends, and that the concert of Europe is a creed outworn. Under the inspiration of this idea he has committed this country to the support of the most reactionary government in Europe, and has given a tendency to events which is rapidly hardening Anglo-German relations into a condition of permanent antagonism. The Entente under him has taken a sinister colour, and the inflexibility of his mind, unqualified by large knowledge, swift apprehension of events, or urgent passion for humanity, constitutes a peril to the future. His aims are high, his honour stainless, but the slow movement of his mind and his unquestioning faith in the honesty of those on whom he has to rely render it easy for him to drift into courses which a more imaginative sense and a swifter instinct would lead him to question and repudiate. What of the future? It depends partly on whether the centre of gravity in Liberalism shifts to the right or the left. If to the right, then the highest place in the State is within his scope, for though he is superficially little in sympathy with the eager spirit of the new Liberalism, he is not essentially at variance with it. The Whig temperament is in him a restraint upon the tongue rather than a restraint of thought. His views are often more advanced than his habit of stating them. But his love of the rod of the fisherman is greater than his love of the rod of empire, and, like Danton, he would probably hold that it is better to keep a flock of sheep upon the hillside than meddle with the government of men. One day, it may be, he will shake the dust of Westminster from his feet for ever, and then we shall know where to look for him. For he himself, I remember, pictured that happy time with delighted anticipation when replying on one occasion to a toast proposed by Mr. Churchill. It is a time of unlimited leisure that we shall spend with old friends in a library. There is a garden outside the library, and of course a suitable river, not flowing too fast, nor at the same time flowing too slow, which is a worse fault. That will be the happiest time of all. I, in those days, shall have no thought of politics except to read the report of the brilliant speeches which Mr. Churchill will still be making in the House of Commons. Just think, those of you who are engaged in political occupations, what our libraries are now compared with, what they will be when we get old, the quantities of clippings, the drawers full of opponents' speeches kept in the hope of being able to produce a quotation at an inconvenient moment. Pamphlets and magazines by the hundredweight, blue books and Hansards by the ton. I think of the splendid time I shall have making a bonfire of them all. How I will stir the fire, and how I will mulch my rose-trees with the ashes. It is a pleasant picture. We may fittingly leave him mulching his rose-trees, or going out with his rod to that delightful river which flows neither too fast nor too slow. A copy of The Complete Angler peeps from one pocket, and White's Selborne from another, and around him is the great book of nature that never wearies. Perhaps in that serene solitude one will come to him as Maximinian came to Diocletian, who had resigned the imperial purple, asking him to resume the reins of government. He rejected the temptation, says Gibbon, with a smile of pity, calmly observing that if he could show Maximian the cabbages which he had planted with his own hand at Salona, he should no longer be urged to relinquish the enjoyment of happiness for the pursuit of power. I think I see Sir Edward showing his visitor his basket of trout and pointing to his rosebuds and the whispering woods as his answer to the appeal to return to the dusty strife of politics. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. James Keir Hardie. I am not sure that when the historian of the future discusses our time, he will not find the most significant event on that day in 1892 when James Keir Hardie rode up to Westminster from West Ham, clothed in cloth cap, tweed suit, and flannel shirt, and accompanied by a band. The world scoffed at the vulgarity or shuddered at the outrage, according to its humour. But the event was nevertheless historic. It marked the emergence of a new force in politics. It was a prophet who came, a prophet in ill-country clothes, wild-eyed, speaking in accents as rugged and uncouth as his garb. A prophet, you say, this dour demagogue a prophet? And why not? The prophet has always been dour and generally a demagogue. Even Cromwell, who had been to Cambridge and was, among other things, a brewer, was both. Sir Philip Warwick, entering the House one day and seeing him on his feet, has left his picture for all time, a gloomy-browed man with harsh, discordant voice, dressed in ill-country clothes and having a splash of blood on his collar. A most unamiable figure to the polite mind of the Cavalier, but a prophet, a rock on which the ship of the Cavaliers was to go to pieces. And whether you like him or not, Keir Hardie was a rock too, in those days when he stood, gloomy and alone, in the midst of the Amalekites. It needed such a man for such a role. The prophet is never a comfortable person. He would not be a prophet if he were. "Tammas is gey ill to live wi'," said Carlyle's mother of her famous son, and Mr. Keir Hardie, who shares Carlyle's rage with the world, as well as Carlyle's dialect and gloomy brow, is gey ill to live wi' too. He glowers at life from beneath his mournful eyebrows, and he confounds us all in one universal malediction. He shrinks from contact with society as from the touch of contamination. It is the quality of guilt as well as of pitch to defile. He will not be defiled by the guilt of the prosperous. You will never find a dress shirt under the red tie of Keir Hardie. He will never be petted by prince and peers. He is the pit lad of politics. He refuses to be anything else, for he has none of the spirit of Smiles' self-help. It is true that outwardly his career fulfills all the conditions of a Smiles hero. He went down the pit shaft, a little lad of 8, to win his bread. He never had a day's schooling. His mother taught him to read, but he was 17 before he could write his name. He taught himself shorthand, practising the characters on the face of the coal seam where he worked. He read Carlyle and Stuart Mill, and came out of the pit at 23 with an idea, a purpose, a vision. He would be an Ishmaelite. He would create a party of political Ishmaelites, and with them he would march into the fat pastures of Canaan and challenge the ancient tyrants, a fierce, intractable man, his hand against every man, and every man's hand against him. Today his dream is accomplished. Whether titular leader or not, he is the chief figure and inspirer of that group of which he was the first begetter. But success has not been crowned with the reward that attended the Smiles hero, whose hardships were admirable because they led to plenty and the companionship of the great. Mr. Keir Hardie has had no visible reward. I do not think he wants reward. His home is still in the little cottage at Cumnock, where he was once a pit lad, and in London you must still seek him in that lodging in the ancient house off Fetter Lane, where, when he first sought a room, the good landlady, scanning the rough figure, demanded references and was placated by the names of half a dozen members of Parliament. He clings to his poverty with the pride of a Highland chieftain. For he is proud with the secretive pride of his country. The vanity of the Englishman is flagrant and assertive. It displays itself with the frankness of a child and expires at a sneer. But the pride of the Scotsman hugs itself close. It is like the camomile. The more it is trodden on, the better it grows. It asks for no recognition. It is self-contained. Flattery cannot exalt it. Inappreciation cannot wound it. It never comes to the surface, and is most happy when it is most misunderstood. When Mr. Keir Hardie was entering the house one day, a policeman stopped him. "Are you at work here, mate?" he asked. "Yes," was the laconic reply. "On the roof?" "No, on the floor." And he passed in, happy in the pride that would not reveal itself. An Englishman would have wanted a policeman's number and would have had his day embittered by wounded vanity. And I can imagine that the happiest moment Mr. Hardy ever had was when he was arrested in Brussels in mistake for Rubino the assassin. I think he would rejoice to be hanged as the wrong man. The knowledge that he was right and his executioners were wrong would fill his last moments with a sombre joy. He is, too, the most typical Scotsman in the House, in appearance and outlook. He is the knight of the rueful countenance. His face is cast in a tragic mould, and his temperament has the gloom of Calvinism and the severity of the Shorter Catechism. When your eye passes from the cheerful Irishman behind him to his sad and foreboding figure, you recall a passage in one of Scott's letters. While a Scotchman is thinking about the term day, or, if easy on that subject, about hell and the next world, while an Englishman is making a little hell in the present because his muffin is not well toasted, Pat's mind is always turned to fun and ridicule. There is no fun and ridicule about Mr. Keir Hardie, and the perfectibility of his muffin leaves him uncheered. He has a soul too sorrowful to be moved by muffins. His figure brings up the vision of the Covenanters and that grey Galloway land where about the graves of the martyrs the whaups are crying. One seems to see him outrivaling Habakkuk Mucklewrath in the dark frenzy of his declamation and rushing to the attack at Bothwell Brig with damnatory psalms upon his lips. The child-man of Plato's fancy, who had come to maturity in some dark cave and suddenly emerged into the light of day, was intoxicated by the glory and splendour of the universe. He was filled with wonder at the miracle which we have ceased to see. When Mr. Keir Hardie emerged from the pit, he was filled with wonder too, but it was wonder at the fantastic disorder of society, at a world in which realities are buried deep beneath a cake of custom and convention, where we see not the thing but the appearance, not the cause but the effect, and where the point of view is still that of the northern farmer. "'Tisn't them as has money that breaks into houses and steals, them as has goats to their backs and takes their regular meals. Nah, it's them as niver knaws where a meal is to be had. Take my word for it, Sammy, the poor in a loop is bad." He has kept the freshness of that first revelation. The wonder light is still in his eye. Contact with the world has not blurred his sight. He remains a seer, not dazzled by shows, but with his eye fixed on realities. It was not rudeness that he intended when, on a memorable occasion, he spoke of bigamy in a certain connection. It was that his eye penetrated the polite fiction and came to the plain human fact. And when he attacked the late Lord Salisbury in connection with some slum revelations and said, "I would not remain a member of a club which admitted his lordship to membership," he was not insolent or even humorous, though the world laughed at the joke. He simply saw the naked fact. The circumstance that it was a Prime Minister who owned slum property did not make the fact less flagrant, but more. I have been told by one who was present that his animus towards the Liberal party dates from a meeting when a local Liberal of consequence refused to go on the platform if the irreconcilable miner's agent were allowed to be on the platform too, and when he was left to nurse his wrath outside. But he never was and never could be a Liberal. He is a rebel ridden by a theory. Liberalism stands for the adaptation of existing society to new needs. He stands for the recreation of society. Toryism is an ally. It stands for the old structure, crumbling and decayed. It makes his task possible, while Liberalism, by making the structure habitable and watertight, defeats his dream. One of the three Socialist leaders of European reputation, he is the most doctrinaire. Jaurès has the statesman's outlook and applies his theories to the practical criticism of government. Bebel is a man of affairs. He revels in the fight. As he talks to you, his eye twinkles with merriment and sly enjoyment. He is always happy, always sanguine. A pleasant, human man, enjoying the drama of politics with its cut and thrust, its humours and its gravities. Mr. Keir Hardie is solitary and menacing, an embodied theory. He is not a politician or a statesman. He is a fanatic. The politician must temporise and compromise. He yields as little as he can and takes as much as he can. He studies the weather and is governed by the seasons. He equivocates and waits upon circumstance. The fanatic knows nothing of this opportunism. The thunder is always on his brow, the lightning always in his eye, the fire at his heart always smouldering into flame. He is a man obsessed with an idea. It gives him no rest, and he gives you no rest. Hence Mr. Keir Hardie's failure as a parliamentarian. He has none of the plasticity necessary for the man of affairs. He is stiff and irreconcilable. He is indifferent to detail. He has no gratitude for small mercies. His eye is on the far-off vision. He is the only man who could have created the Labour Party, for concentration and intensity are the creative impulses. But he is almost the only man in the party who is not fitted to lead it. It is plain common-sense men like Mr. Shackleton and Mr. Henderson, and astute politicians like Mr. Ramsay MacDonald, who have made it a political instrument. His party is not as himself. He is as isolated in it as when he stood alone in the House. For no party can exist on anathema and prophecy. A cause comes into being at the breath of the prophet, and then leaves him in the desert. It goes without saying that there is a strain of poetry in him. For no poetry, no idealism. The prophet must not only see the naked fact, he must have the visionary gleam. It goes without saying, too, that it is the poetry of Burns, with its fierce democratic passion and its exaltation of the humble and the sincere, that appeals most to him. One who heard him lecture on Burns told me that it revealed to him a world of unsuspected tenderness and emotion in the heart of this rugged, uncompromising man. But indeed it must be so. It is the fierce antipathies of the theorist that the world sees, but deep down in his heart these antipathies are seen to have their roots in a sympathy as fierce, the sympathy with the class from which he sprang, and which he has never deserted. He hates the palace because he remembers the pit. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Prophets, Priests and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Lord Northcliffe. I was talking one day in the garden of a friend of mine on the subject of Stevenson, when he brought forth a file of Young Folks for 1881, containing The Sea Cook, and another for 1884, in which appeared The Black Arrow. Turning the yellow pages, he casually pointed to an article, one of a series, on amateur photography. "There," said he, "are the modest beginnings of greatness. Today the writer of that humble article is Master of the Times, a member of the House of Lords, owner of half the papers you see in the hands of the people, the Napoleon of the press. Whether you like it or not, the most influential man in this country." For the name under the article was Alfred C. Harmsworth. "How has it been done?" he asked. "What manner of man is this Lord Northcliffe?" "I have," I said, "the privilege of not knowing Lord Northcliffe. I am that miracle in these days, a journalist who has never been through his mill, never written a line for him, nor met him, nor, except when he has been in the Peers' Gallery of the House of Commons, even seen him. I am, therefore, well qualified to answer your question, for I can view him without any personal emotion, which I believe is a rare thing in a journalist. Lord Northcliffe is the type of the man in the street. There is no psychological mystery to be unravelled here, no intellectual shadowland. He is obvious and elementary, a man who understands material success and nothing else. He has no other standard by which to judge life. Napoleon's question was, "What have you done?" Lord Northcliffe's question would be, "What have you got?" For he not only wants success himself, he admires it in others. It is the passport to his esteem. It is the thing he understands. If you will watch his career, you will see that, as far as he has a philosophy at all, it is this, that merit rides in a motor car. You become interesting to him, as Johnson became interesting to Chesterfield, immediately you have succeeded. When he went down to the memorable meeting at Glasgow, at which Mr. Chamberlain formally opened his fiscal campaign, he changed his policy in a night. His papers had been full of denunciations of what he had christened the stomach tax, but this meeting, so great and so enthusiastic, seemed the presage of success. He was going to be left in company with that dismal thing, failure. The thing was unthinkable, and he leapt the fence on the instant. For he believes with Mr. Bigelow that a merciful Providence fashioned us hollow in order that we might our principles swallow. The one principle to which his loyalty never falters is to be on the side of the big battalions. This habit of swift decision, dictated without regard to principle, is the key to his success. He carries no intellectual or moral impedimenta, has no sentiment, is subject to no theory, holds no view of life. He simply asks what will win, and then, to quote Mr. Bigelow again, goes inter it bald-headed. He is, in a word, the Stock Exchange man in the sphere of journalism. He represents the conquest of Fleet Street by Capel Court. Go on the Stock Exchange, and you will find it crowded with Lord Northcliffe's, men of that rapid, decisive type who bull and bear with happy indifference to intrinsic merit, and to whom the issues of peace and war are of importance only as they affect the price of stock and shares. When Lord Northcliffe set out to feed the war flame in South Africa, he did so, I think, without any real feeling against the Boers. He is not, I fancy, a man who bears malice, for to bear malice involves attachment to some point of view, indicates some reality of character. Had the Boers won, he would probably have written them a letter of congratulation. But the mood of the country was high and turbulent. We were full of such boastings as the Gentiles use and lesser breeds without the law. And his conception of journalism is to give the public the meat it craves for. If it wants a war, then it is his duty to paint the enemy black and horrific. If it wants a sensation, then it is his task to provide it. Does the temper of the moment demand the immolation of France, then he is the fiercest of Francophobes. If the French cannot cease their insults, he says in 1899, their colonies will be taken from them and given to Germany and Italy. The French have succeeded in thoroughly convincing John Bull that they are his inveterate enemies. England has long hesitated between France and Germany, but she has always respected the German character, whereas she has gradually come to feel a contempt for France. Nothing like an entente cordiale can subsist between England and her nearest neighbour. Does the mood change and Germany become the object of national suspicion? Then who so ready to throw faggots on the flame? Yes, we detest the Germans, and we detest them cordially, he says in 1903. They render themselves odious to the whole of Europe. I would not tolerate that anyone should print in my journal the least thing which might today wound France, but on the other hand I would not like anyone to insert anything that could please Germany. He blots out the foolish word consistency from his bright lexicon, and repudiates his yesterdays with fearless indifference to criticism. He knows that the mob has no memory, and only asks for its daily sensation with its daily bread. And so, in the midst of the great German panic, his newspapers made our flesh creep with their revelations of Germany's designs, and Mr. Robert Blatchford was engaged to reduce us to the last pit of fear. Then, the mood of the public being exhausted, he turned and slew the monster of his own invention. He went to Berlin, and from thence sent to his paper a sublime reproof of our silly behaviour, and told us that all Germany was laughing at our panic-stricken folly. Such agility leaves one breathless. He, in fact, regards himself simply as the purveyor of a popular commodity. If the public taste changes, then he is the man who changes with it, for he is wedded to no old clothes. He is truly considered a humble-minded person. His opinions are of so little consequence that he is always prepared to adopt those of other people, provided that they represent the majority. In 1904, when the Progressives looked like winning, he supported them. In 1907, when they were certain to lose, he filled his papers with fantastic stories of their misdeeds. It is not that he disagreed with them, for disagreement implies convictions of some sort. It was simply that he was with the crowd. He backs an opinion as he would back a horse, because he believes it will win. He reminds me of that story of Lord Chancellor Thurlow and the Nonconformist deputation that went to him to protest against some unjust advantage he had given to the Established Church. "Why," asked the deputation, "do you always show this partiality for the Established Church?" "I show partiality for the Established Church," said Thurlow, "because it is established. Get your sect established, and then I'll show partiality to you." It is this absolutely commercial conception of journalism which is Lord Northcliffe's contribution to his time. Journalism was a profession. He has made it a trade. It had a moral function. In his hands it has no more moral significance than the manufacture of soap. The old notion in regard to a newspaper was that it was a responsible adviser of the public. Its first duty was to provide the news, uncoloured by any motive, private or public. Its second, to present a certain view of public policy which it believed to be for the good of the State and the community. It was sober, responsible, and a little dull. It treated life as if it was a serious matter. It had an antiquated respect for truth. It believed in the moral governance of things. Lord Northcliffe has changed all this. He started free from all convictions. He saw an immense unexploited field. The old journalism appealed only to the minds of the responsible public. He would appeal to the emotions of the irresponsible. The old journalism gave news. He would give sensation. The old journalism gave reasoned opinion. He would give unreasoning passion. When Captain Flanagan, from the calm retreat of the debtors' prison, was drawing up the prospectus of the Pall Mall Gazette, he said proudly that it would be written by gentlemen for gentlemen. Lord Northcliffe conceived a journal which, in Lord Salisbury's phrase, was written by office boys for office boys. It was a bitter saying, but Lord Northcliffe has had his revenge. He, Lord Salisbury's office boy of journalism, was raised to the peerage by Lord Salisbury's nephew. It was not the only case in which time passed an ironic comment on Lord Salisbury's views on the press. When Gladstone repealed the stamp duty and made the penny paper possible, Lord Robert Cecil asked scornfully what good thing could come out of a penny paper. A cheap press, like an enlarged franchise, meant to his gloomy and fatalistic mind red ruin and the breaking up of laws. And he lived to see himself swept in power by the democracy which he had feared, and deriving his support from the halfpenny press, at which he would have shuddered. He lived, in fact, to realize that there is a better way with the office boy than to drive him into revolutionary movements. It is to give him a vote and the Daily Mail. I have said that Lord Northcliffe is the man in the street. That is, that his mind is always in tune with the mood of the populace. You see it in this article in Young Folks. Amateur photography had just become popular. He, a lad of 18, seized on it as a stepping stone to fortune. A little later came the boom in cycling, and Master Harmsworth, still in his teens, became a cycling journalist in Coventry. Sir George Newnes had touched the great heart of humanity with titbits, and Mr. Harmsworth, now a man of 21, felt that here was a field for his genius also. He, too, would tell men that the streets of London, put end to end, would stretch across the Atlantic, and that there were more acres in Yorkshire than letters in the Bible. Why should he conceal these truths? Why should the public thirst for knowledge be denied? And so, in an upper room in the neighbourhood of the Strand, Answers came to birth, the prolific parent of some 100, or perhaps 200, I am not sure which, offspring, ranging from the Funny Wonder to the Daily Mail, all bearing the impress of the common mind in an uncommon degree, the freedom from ideas, the love of the irrelevant and the trivial, the admiration for the flagrant and the loud, the divorce from all the sobrieties and sanities of life. The fate of the Times was long in doubt, and the secret of its new control was carefully concealed. But one day it appeared with several columns describing the dress at some society function, Lady Midas's wonderful creation from Worth's, and the Duchess of Blankshire's rapturous pearls, and I knew the touch of the master hand. The marvellous office boy had no more worlds left to conquer. Perhaps the crucial moment of his life was that day in the early 90s when a young man who had been a reporter on the Birmingham Daily Mail and afterwards on the Sun called on him with a scheme. The Evening News was for sale, and the enterprising young man had got the refusal of it, and gave Mr. Harmsworth 12 hours to decide whether he would buy it, his own reward being the editorship and a share in the business. So far Mr. Harmsworth had only adorned the sphere of tit-bit journalism. He seized this opportunity to serve his country in a larger sphere, and out of that day's work came the Daily Mail, with which the ideals of American journalism were brought into our midst, and all the multitude of daily papers with which he has endowed us. He is, you see, a man of bold and swift decisions. When he found the women did not want a women's daily paper, he changed it in a night into a halfpenny picture paper, and instantly he found his way to the feminine heart. He is doubtful whether women want votes, but he discovered that they do want pictures, stuck in anyhow, with hardly any words at all. He has adroitness, too. When the Daily Telegraph started a Sunday issue, he followed suit. Instantly there was a great outcry in the country against the Sunday newspaper. To that outcry Lord Burnham and Lord Northcliffe bowed with grave professions of respect for religious opinion. Subsequently Lord Northcliffe purchased 2 Sunday papers, already existing, and nothing was said, though we may assume that Lord Burnham thought a good deal. There were few earlier birds about than Lord Northcliffe. He touches nothing that he does not, shall we say, adorn. The note of his mind is over all he does. I was looking the other day at one of his multitudinous publications, a children's cyclopedia. It contained a picture of the solar system, the sun blazing in the centre and the planets careering around it, and each planet was depicted by a motor car. He can make even the splendours of the midnight sky speak in the terms of the momentary and sordid earth. No doubt the men sitting in those motor cars were reading the Daily Mail. I am told that in his office he has a favourite phrase about the shop window. What is wrong with the shop window today, he will say, as he points to the offending issue. It is an eloquent phrase. He is the shop window journalist. The sign over the journalist's office in the old days was Martian d'idées. Now it is the latest novelties, and the editor is the chief shop walker. Is your mood for conquest? Then here is the material to feed your hate or your fear of the foreigner. Is health the craze of the moment? Then standard bread becomes a gospel more urgent than the Decalogue. Are you tired of panics and in need of nature's balm? Then the shop window is aflame with sweet peas, and we are all turned out into our gardens to engage in a feverish competition for the finest blooms and the biggest prizes. He is all that is summed up in that desolating word, smart. He is a smart man, the representative man of a smart age. It is an age which, if it has ever heard of Lord Courtenay, regards him only as a dull old gentleman who bores you with talk about principles. It delights in the man who will advertise himself in 12-foot letters. It worships success, however it is achieved. You may be exposed as often as you like. All will be forgiven if only you will be smart. You may espouse one cause to-day and another to-morrow, one cause here and another there. It does not matter, so long as you do it with effrontery and success. And its patriotism is that strange inverted thing which makes Little Englander a phrase of withering reproach, as though to love England were impious. It is not that it believes the wrong things, it is that it has ceased to believe anything. Its drama is the music hall, its moral teacher Mr. Hall Caine, its instructor the inspired office boy. As I came along in the tube to see you, I took notice of the papers in the people's hands. The fat gentleman on one side of me was reading the Globe, the slim lady on the other the Daily Mirror, the smart office boy in front the Daily Mail, the meek person next the Sunday Companion, the lad in the corner Comic Cuts. There were Evening Newses and Red Magazines, Puck and the World. The papers were different, but the accents were one. Where Lord Northcliffe was not, there was Mr. C. Arthur Pearson, his pale shadow. The revolution is complete. The old journalism is dead. The voice of answers speaks in the thunders of the times, and Lord Northcliffe bestrides the world like a colossus, the type of power without the sense of responsibility, of material success without moral direction. "You have spoken truly," said the other, "though I think Watts has put the thing more tersely in his picture of Mammon. But you paint the time too gloomily. It is a time of change and disturbance and fickleness and strange forms come to the surface. But out of the welter the New England is emerging with a new social gospel and a new vision. Lord Northcliffe, with his shop-window novelties, is but a transition phase. He is only the echo of the passing mood and the shallow craze. The great movement is coming from below and is independent of all the inanities of the press. Be of good cheer. We are a people yet. And now to resume. When I met Stevenson at Bournemouth." End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Prophets, Priests and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Dr. Clifford. When Mr. Balfour said that what he did not like about Dr. Clifford was his style, he expressed the vital difference between himself and his critic. They are as east and west, and never the twain shall meet. Mr. Balfour lives in an atmosphere of aesthetic emotion, delicately sensuous, soft and languorous. One pictures him on a couch of rose-leaves in a chamber where the colour harmonies are perfect and no fierce disturbing light breaks in. The air is soft and aromatic, and from behind the curtains comes the tender breathing of lute and viol. He feels a harsh note like a blow. A false accent in voice or colour or gesture afflicts him with physical distress. One would expect him to flee, hands to ears, from the violence of Tchaikovsky's 1812 or the poignant humanity of Beethoven, and to find refuge in the dream world of Chopin or the Watteau landscapes of Gluck. To such a temperament, life is neither a tragedy nor a comedy. It is an emotion. It is not a battle, but a dream vision, not a shattering reality, but a tone poem. Into that atmosphere the Puritan bursts like a bombshell in the garden of old Khayyam. He is terribly earnest, and there is nothing so distressing to the aesthete as earnestness. You cannot have a flawless tone poem with an earnest man about. You cannot enjoy your book of verse beneath the bough if a fierce person breaks in upon you with violent gesticulations, declaring that the city of destruction is in flames and that you have got to go and help with the fire engine. To the Puritan, life is not an emotion to be enjoyed, but a conflict to be won, and he distrusts those sensuous decorations that distract the mind from the spiritual warfare. He is happiest when the battle is fiercest, and I can imagine that Dr. Clifford must sometimes lament that he was born 2½ centuries too late. Had he lived in the great days of the Puritans, how joyously would he have had his ears cropped, with what hymns and psalms and spiritual songs he would have rushed to battle, and when the victory was won, what sermons he would have preached as the sun went down on the carnage of the battlefield. Cromwell's eye would have singled him out for swift promotion. He would have been one of those russet-coated captains whom he loved. He would have had him by him when he told the Reverend Dr. Hitch in Ely Cathedral to cease his fooling and come down. And I see him in the grey dawn of that day at Dunbar, turning to him to give the keynote of the battle song, and the young Clifford, now a colonel of the Ironsides, lifts his voice, "Let God arise, and scattered let all his enemies be." He would have sat in judgment at Whitehall upon the man Charles Stuart, and would have spent his old age in preaching secretly in out-of-the-way conventicles, in prison oft, in the pillory and the stocks more often, harried from parish to parish, a stern, invincible old warrior, waiting for the return of the saints and keeping the lamp trimmed and burning through the riotous night of the Restoration. For he is the last of the Puritans. When Oxford and Cambridge opened their doors to dissenters, they ended the true Puritan strain. They infused into its strenuous intensity the subtle influences of an atmosphere of taste and culture. They softened the severe outlines, added light and shade, nuance and tone, where formerly the character was simply and sharply defined. To grace in the Puritan sense they have added the graces in the Cavalier sense. Dr. Clifford is the type of the nonconformist minister of the old days of proscription and disability, with all the merits and all the defects of the stern school out of which he came. He is a man who has carved himself with his own jackknife. His university, Castle's Popular Educator, which he bought in penny numbers, and his rugged personality bears the splendid impress of that unaided workmanship. He came from the people and he belongs to the people, in a sense in which perhaps he could not have belonged had not the Catechism stood in his path to Oxford. For when the little son of the warp machiner at Sawley in Derbyshire was sent to the National School, the master, attracted by his capacity, promised to get him to Oxford. But the Puritan father was not to be bribed by Oxford. He would have no catechisms taught his son. "John," he would say, "I'll not have you tell a lie. You must not talk of your godfathers and godmothers when you haven't got any." And so, instead of going to Oxford, he went, at the age of 10, into a lace mill, where he advanced from the position of a jacker-off to that of a threader. As threader, he will tell you, I had to work in a gang preparing the carriages and the bobbins for the big machines. If we fell behind, the machines would be delayed, so that we often had to keep at it far into the night, with the foreman setting one gang to compete with another. Our food was sent to us from home. Coffee in a tin, bread with a bit of cheese perhaps, or butter, though butter seldom, for we still felt the effect of the Corn Laws. Meat possibly once a week. It was a hard school in which the character was hammered out strong, real, and enduring, or shattered in the process. But if he is the last of the Puritans in character, equipment, and temperament, he has none of the harshness of the Calvinist theology. He is all for the sanctity of conscience and the right of private judgment in the affairs of the soul. He will impose no creeds on anyone, not even on his church. His own faith is still as clear and primitive as when, 60 years ago, he sat a boy in Beeston Chapel, in much mental anguish, and, in his own words, experienced conversion in the midst of the singing of the verse, "The soul that longs to see my face is sure my love to gain, and those that early seek my grace shall never seek in vain." But he is for the spirit and not for the letter. He will not make his own faith the measure of his neighbour's, and when Charles Spurgeon began his downgrade controversy and sought to rivet anew the Calvinistic dogma on the Baptist Church, it was John Clifford, then president of the Baptist Union, who fought the battle of liberation and won. "I do not object to creeds as statements of belief," he said. "It is coercion through and by creeds that I object to." He was willing and even assisted to formulate a declaration of the Church's faith, but beyond that he would not go. He would not apply it as a test to the individual conscience. Creed or declaration became the issue, and Spurgeon passed out of the Baptist Church with his Calvinist doctrines and his assertion of the verbal inspiration of the Bible, while Dr. Clifford remained within victorious. And so, when Mr. Campbell raised the waters with his new theology, it was Dr. Clifford, almost alone among nonconformist leaders, who took his stand by him in sympathy not with his views, but with liberty of thought. Hatred of creeds and passion for the freedom of an awakened conscience are the two motives that actuate him. How long is it, asked Holmes, since religion was such an invalid that it could only go out in a closed carriage with a gentleman in a black suit and a white tie on the box? Dr. Clifford insists that religion is an active pedestrian who wants plenty of light and moorland air. He will not sit on the box, nor wear a white tie, nor call himself reverend, nor name any man heretic. He believes, with Renan's Hebrew Jew, that on fait que son veut, mais on croit ce qu'on peut. He has no fear of consequences if only men will think. It is not unbelief, but non-belief, not the conscience that questions, but the conscience that is atrophied, that he assails. Think for yourselves, he cries. If you find that it is not rational to be a Christian, then be not a Christian. But reflect well before you decide. He is the antithesis of those Christians who, in Swift's phrase, have just enough religion to hate each other. He is all tolerance. He does not deliver the law from an infallible throne, but comes down, as it were, into the marketplace and talks the thing out with you, a plain man like yourself, offering you his opinions and seeking yours. Hence his attraction for all sorts and conditions of men, his long friendship with freethinkers like Coelho, and his monthly question nights, when he meets all assailants on a common ground, not avoiding contradiction, but seeking it. You must understand a man's doctrine before you attack it, is his axiom. He has the serenity and the unconquerable optimism of the man who believes in the moral sovereignty of the world. Personalities pass and disappear, he cries, but the principle of justice is eternal. Ignorant men may nail it to the cross, but the third day it rises again and mounts to heaven. And this triumph of the spirit of righteousness is reflected in the life of men. Our lecturer thinks the world is getting better, said a Social Democrat at the close of an address. Now, I don't think it is. But I know it is, replied Dr. Clifford. I know that when I was 10 I was called at 6 o'clock in the morning to go and work 12 or 14 hours in a lace factory, and I know that no boy of 10 will be called at 6 tomorrow morning to be forced to work in any factory in the land. His mind is all daylight. There are no subtle half-tones or sensitive reserves or significant shadows of silence, no landscape fading through purple mists to a romantic distance. All is clear, obvious, emphatic. There is little atmosphere and a lack of that humour that softens the contours of controversy. His thought is direct and simple, and makes its appeal, not to culture, but to the primitive emotions. He is probably the best popular orator in England. The strenuousness which is so distasteful to Mr. Balfour is a battle cry to the crowd. He keeps his passion white hot. His body works like a windmill in a hurricane. His eyes flash lightnings. He seizes the enemy, as it were, by the throat, pummels him with breathless blows, and throws him aside a miserable wreck. In the pulpit his slight, bent form moves restlessly to and fro. He fixes someone with his glittering eye, argues with him, as it were, wrestles with him, poses him with questions, draws back to make a point, leaps forward, and explodes. Punch declares that he wears 2 cravats, one in front and one behind, so that in the midst of his passionate speeches the one behind can take the place of that in front. In the case of a long speech, the cravat behind recovers its position in front, having made a complete tour of the doctor. This, of course, is an exaggeration, but he is energetic. This moral and intellectual strenuousness makes him the symbol of all that is hateful to the foe. He is pictured as a bitter, intolerant, assertive man. He is, in fact, one of the gentlest, most humble-minded men I have known, simple and unaffected, merry as a child and delighting in children, easily imposed on by the melting tale, overflowing with generous sympathy, entirely free from all personal bitterness. It is the custom of the meaner part of the press to jibe at his degree, to represent him as a charlatan flaunting a sham honour. Doctor, indeed! Does it come from Oxford or Cambridge? Not at all. From Bates University, in the United States. And at the oft-told tale there is a gust of scornful laughter. And there is an end of Dr. Clifford. It is a foolish and ungenerous taunt. If Oxford and Cambridge have not offered him the honour, so much the worse for Oxford and Cambridge. He does not ask it, did not ask it of Bates University, has never himself used it. But what man of our time has a higher claim to recognition from any seat of learning or worth? What story is more fascinating, more full of wholesome stimulus, than that of his eager pursuit of knowledge under difficulties, working in the mill all day, studying far into the night, taking, now a youth, his theological course at Leicester, and having started on that 50 years' ministry at Westbourne Park, not sinking down into a comfortable rut, but setting out bravely to London University to lay the foundations that circumstances had denied him. And well he laid them, working all the time at his pastorate, Bachelor of Arts in 1861, Bachelor of Science with honours in logic, moral philosophy, geology and paleontology in 1862, Master of Arts, first of his year in 1864, Bachelor of Laws with honours in the Principles of Legislation in 1866. Nothing to blush for here, is there? And then add to it those 50 years spent in tireless and unselfish labour for all noble human causes, in the front rank of every fight against tyranny and intolerance, whether in the spiritual or the political sphere, whether in London or Africa, loving truth and justice even more than religion and piety, a great citizen, a great patriot, spending himself ungrudgingly for the reward of a head clerk, as poor at the end, save for the modest competence presented to him by his admirers on his 70th birthday, as at the beginning. "What is your fee?" asked the secretary at the close of a lecture in a remote part of England. "My third-class fare," he answered. There are few lives that one would rather have lived than his, a life rich in unselfish service that has kept his roots watered and his branches green. So true is it that what I gave I have. You may dislike his style, you may find the note too strident for your sensitive taste, you may resent the moral maxim and the passionate truism, but do not pride yourself upon living in the atmosphere of an artificial culture in which no man of breeding talks of principles, and in which the ripeness of emotion passes insensibly into the rottenness of moral decadence. For there is a far worse cant than the cant of morality, and that is the cant of culture. No nation was ever kept sweet and vital by moral opiates, and it is because he is a bracing tonic in a time of moral slackness that John Clifford ranks among the chief assets of our day. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, John Redmond. When I first looked down upon the House of Commons, there was one figure that above all others touched the imagination. He sat in the corner seat below the gangway, cold, isolated, silent, a man nursing his gloomy wrath and his unconquerable hope. The sad eyes looked out with a sleepless passion from under the level and lowering brows. He affected you like the thundercloud. Presently, you felt, the forked lightning would leap out of the gloom and strike the offending earth. He held you by the fascination of the unknown. He was a dark secret, an idea incarnate. Near by him sat a young man of Napoleonic profile, the Roman nose boldly sculptured, the chin firm, rounded, protruding, the eye full and fearless. Today that young man, young no longer, sits in the corner seat. The thundercloud has vanished. Instead, there is something of the warmth and generosity of frank comradeship with the House. For Parnell was the symbol of Ireland's despair and Ireland's hate. Mr. Redmond is the symbol of Ireland's hope and Ireland's expansiveness. He is the leader in a happier day. The sky has cleared and the end is in view. The old passions have passed away, and with the new and more humane and enlightened spirit has come the need of a new leadership. It required Parnell's fierce intensity to create the cause, and to carry it through the wilderness. It needs another strategy to enter the promised land. Parnell was the incomparable guerrilla chief, mysterious, secret, elusive, touching the imagination of his followers to a sort of frenzy of devotion. Mr. Redmond is the commander-in-chief of a regular army, pursuing his campaign in the open country according to the laws of parliamentary strategy. He is not a dictator. He is the head of a staff. Mr. Redmond could not wear the rebel robe, for his genius is parliamentary and constitutional. He is indeed one of the ablest parliamentarians in the House. He has the spirit of Parliament in his blood. 4 generations of his family have sat in the House, and he himself learned the rules as a clerk in the House, and later by breaking them in those thrilling days when the duty of every Irish member was to smash the machine of government. When he rises in his spacious, authoritative way, the House has that air of silence and respect which it only wears in the presence of a master. It is difficult to remember that this grave senatorial figure, who comes into action with waving banners and measured pomp, learned the art of war in the fierce school of faction and rebellion. His baptism was in blood. It was in 1880 that he made his first appearance in politics, side by side with Parnell. He accompanied the chief on the platform at Enniscorthy, in his native Wexford, when Parnell was pelted with rotten eggs and brutally attacked. Parnell remained impassive through it all. When an egg struck him on the head, said Mr. Redmond in telling the story, he never even raised his hand to brush it off, but calmly went on with his speech. Afterwards, in the hotel, he took his lunch as calmly, while a tailor stitched his torn trousers. Later on that memorable day, young Redmond was attacked by a mob in the streets, knocked down and cut on the face. Parnell met him and remarked, "Why, you are bleeding. What's the matter?" Being told, he said with his cold smile, "Well, you have shed your blood for me, at all events." Nor was his advent in the House less dramatic. He had intended to stand for the Wexford seat, vacated by the death of his father, but Parnell selected Mr. Tim Haley for the seat, and young Redmond loyally supported the chief's nominee. In the following February of 1881 he was returned for Ross. They were stirring times, he told me, and I got a telegram from Parnell to come at once. I crossed the Channel immediately, took my seat, and was suspended with all the rest of the party the same night for refusing to vote. But not before I had made my maiden speech. It was brief but conclusive. The Speaker called on me to withdraw, and I said, "Mr. Speaker, I decline to withdraw." That was all, but I had broken the ice. He took his share in many such scenes. We were most of us high-spirited young fellows, fresh from the university, and enjoyed that rough campaigning. Today the House has no warmer admirer. Putting aside its attitude to Ireland, he says, it is the finest assembly in the world, so manly and generous. It has tenderness, too. It is remorseless to the bore, but the touch of sincere humanity goes to its heart. It came to love Bigger with his quaint figure and his interminable speeches. And you remember how, when Bradlaugh was dying, it passed a resolution cancelling the wrong it had done him. That was a fine and generous act. With all his apparent composure, he has some awe of the House. Familiarity does not breed contempt, he said to me once. I find it harder and not easier to address it than I used. I am discovering that I have nerves. When I am going to make an important speech, I am fidgety and unhappy." He is the orator of the House, the last representative of a tradition that has passed. Other men rise to speak. He rises to deliver an oration. He advances, as it were, with his colours flying and his drums beating. It is no longer a skirmish, but a general engagement. All his rhetorical legions are brought into action with pomp and circumstance. His commanding presence, his strong utterance, his unhurried manner give a certain dignity and authority to his lightest word. He could make the multiplication table sound as impressive as a funeral oration, and the alphabet would fall from his lips with the solemn cadence of Homeric verse. To hear him say, "Mr. Speaker, sir," is alone a liberal education in the art of saying nothing with immense seriousness. It is the oratory of the grand manner, like that of Mr. Henry Chaplin. But there is stuff in his speech, while Mr. Chaplin has only stuffing. With all his air of deliberation, he relies largely upon the moment. On one of the rare occasions when he wrote out his speech, he missed the points, picked up his notes, found them in a hopeless confusion, tried again and failed, had a further and unavailing search among his papers, now more hopelessly jumbled than ever, put them away, and sailed off before the wind of his portly eloquence. It was all done with perfect gravity. He is a man who can even break down with dignity and repose. In many respects he is the least representative of Irishmen. He has none of the gay, irresponsible wit of his brother Willie, the idol of the house, who has a tongue as swift as a Dublin Jarvey's and whose interjections explode like joyous crackers on the floor of the chamber. Mr. Willie refuses to be solemn. It is enough for him to be merry and mischievous. He holds that his brother has dignity enough for both. In the hot days after the split, when he replied with his delightful impulsiveness to some exasperating attacks by Mr. Tim Healy, his brother remonstrated with him on the ground that his words were not gentlemanly. "One gentleman in the family is enough, John," he said, with his delightful gaiety, and no doubt went off twirling his shillelagh. Nor has he any of the Celtic mystery and passion which give the philippics of Mr. Tim Healy their touch of magic. Still less has he his spirit of impish mischief. Again, he has not the detachment of John Dillon, a patriot of the Brutus strain, simple, chivalrous, self-forgetful, a man who lives for a cause with a certain stainless purity that ennobles the house and enriches our public life. Mr. Dillon is the poetry of patriotism. Mr. Redmond is its politics. He is the plain, competent business man who has succeeded to the command of the concern and does his work with thoroughness and dispatch, but without passionate intensity or that tyrannic impulse that possessed Parnell. When Parnell was dethroned, he died. If Mr. Redmond were dethroned, you feel that he would simply have more leisure for sport. No one has ever doubted his patriotism, but he has none of the bitterness of fanaticism. He is above all a man of the world and of affairs. The air of the country blows about him, and he loves the wholesome entertainment of life. You are not surprised to learn that he was a good cricketer, and that he still follows the game with interest, that he is happiest tramping the mountains with a dog and a gun, that he can manoeuvre a salmon as skilfully as a parliamentary motion, and sit a horse as firmly as he sits in the saddle of the chief. He is alone a sufficient answer to the foolish view that the Irish have not the gift of self-government. He is one of the ablest generals in the House. He has brought his frail bark through the wildest rapids that any statesman ever navigated. Through all the bitter war that followed the fall of Parnell, he remained loyal to his old chief, loyal in the face of English morality and Irish clericalism. He marched out of the battle with his little band of 9 and wandered with them through the wilderness for nearly 10 years. At last he brought all the scattered flock together, and today even Tiger Tim consents to bear his mild yoke, at least for a time. He has the great virtue of never making enemies, for there is no poison in his shafts. He has about him a spacious and sunlit atmosphere in which the rank growth of personal bitterness cannot live. He can be generous even to his political foes. "I like Balfour," he will tell you. "He bears no malice. When the round is over he shakes hands." After I came out of prison in 1888 he met me in the lobby. "I'm glad to see you back," he said. "I hope you are no worse for it." And he said it in a way that made you feel he meant it. Now that is not the way with Blank. He will not even admit that Mr. Balfour was wholly bad as a Chief Secretary. The worst Chief Secretary by far was Blank, and he mentions a name that fills one with mild surprise. No man of sensitive feeling, he says, can fill that office long. Birrell is too finely strung for it. It needs a man like Walter Long. "I hunt 3 days a week and draw a fat cheque at the end of it," he told an audience in Dublin. He is one of the good type of Tories. You know he is half an Irishman and hunts in my country. He has, you see, a good word for everyone. If the old ferocities of the Irish issue have vanished from the House, it is largely due to him as well as to the softening influence of time. He has no anti-British sentiment and will never talk of cutting the painter. "Our stake in the Empire is too large for us to be detached from it," he said to me. "We Irish have peopled the waste places of Greater Britain. Our roots are imperial as well as national." He rejoices in the new spirit that has come over Ireland. The old religious strife is dying. When I first went to Belfast, I went carrying my life in my hand. In those days you dared not be seen in the streets, and had nowhere to speak save a remote schoolroom, and even there you were not safe. The last time I went to Belfast I spoke in the Ulster Hall, the largest building in the place, and a third of the audience were Protestants. At the close, one after another of them came up and shook hands and spoke cordially about my speech. The world is growing better and saner. Unlike Parnell, he is a Catholic, but in his urbane way he has fought an heroic fight with clericalism. When the Parnell split came, he elected to stand by his political chief and to defy the lightnings of the Church. It needed courage. He has sat in his pew and heard himself denounced by name from the altar as the Antichrist. He has seen the congregation rise in a body and walk out in revolt against the priest. His ultimate triumph was won without sacrifice, and it involved the end of the political domination of the priesthood. The secular power of the priest was split on the rock of Parnellism. There have been moments of weakness. He made a mistake in tactics when he responded to Cardinal Logue's appeal and brought his party over to support the Education Bill in the autumn session of 1902, and his action in moving the rejection of the Irish Council's Bill at the Convention did not square with his reception of the Bill in the House. His judgment is sometimes overruled by expediency. He is not the autocrat of his party, as Parnell was. He rules by consent. When Home Rule comes, it is to be hoped that it will find him still in the saddle. It will be well for Ireland and well for England that his suave spirit should give the note to the new relationship of the two countries, for the fundamental fact about Mr. Redmond is that he stands for peace and goodwill. He is by nature the least combative of men. He has been fighting all his days, but he has always fought as though he loved his foes, and when he passes from St. Stephen's at Westminster to St. Stephen's Green in Dublin, he will not leave a single bitter memory behind him. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Prophets, Priests and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, Florence Nightingale. Lying before me is a manuscript. It is written on large sheets of stout paper, which have turned yellow with the years. The writing, that of a woman, is bold and free, as of one accustomed to the pen, but the fashion of the letters belongs to a long past time. It is an obituary notice of Florence Nightingale, written for the Daily News 51 years ago, when the most famous of Englishwomen was at the point of death. The faded manuscript has lain in its envelope for half a century, unused. The busy pen that wrote it fell for ever from the hand of the writer more than 30 years ago, for that writer was Harriet Martineau. The subject of the memoir still lives, the most honoured and loved of all the subjects of the sovereign. There are tears in that old manuscript, the generous, almost passionate tears of a great soul stricken by a sore bereavement. Miss Martineau was writing within 3 years of the Crimean War, when the name of Florence Nightingale still throbbed with memories vivid as last night's dream, and when her heroism had the dew of the dawn upon it. To-day that name is like a melody of a far-off time, a melody we heard in the remotest days of childhood. Florence Nightingale! It comes o'er the ear like the sweet south, stealing and giving odour. It has perfumed the years with the fragrance of gracious deeds. I have sometimes idly speculated on the strange fortuity of names, on the perfect echo of the name to the deed. Shakespeare, Milton, Wordsworth, Tennyson. Why is it that the world's singers come heralded with these significant names? Why is it that the infinite families of the Smiths and the Robinsons and the Jones never sing? And Oliver Cromwell and John Churchill and Horatio Nelson? Why, there is the roar of guns and the thunder of great deeds in the very accents of their names. And so with the heroines of history, the Grace Darlings and the Florence Nightingales. One almost sees in the latter case events carefully avoiding the commonplace and shaping a lustrous name for the wearer. For her mother was named Smith, the daughter of that William Smith, the famous philanthropist and member for Norwich, who fought the battle of the Dissenters in Parliament and was one of the leaders of the anti-slavery movement. And her father was named Shore, and only assumed the name of Nightingale with the estates that made him a wealthy man. A rose by any other name, no doubt, but the world is grateful for the happy accident that gave it Florence Nightingale. It is a name full of a delicate reminiscence, like the smell of lavender in a drawer, calling up memories of those from whose lips we first heard the story of the Lady with the Lamp. It suggests not a personality, but an influence, not a presence, but a pervasive spirit. For since that tremendous time when the eyes of the whole world were turned upon the gentle figure that moved like a benediction through the horrors of the hospitals of Scutari, Miss Nightingale's life has had something of the quiet of the cloister. It is not merely that her health was finally broken by her unexampled labours. It is that, combined with the courage of the chivalrous world into which she was born, she has the reticence of a temperament that shrinks from publicity with mingled scorn and humility. This rare union of courage and modesty is illustrated by her whole career. When, after a girlhood spent in her native Italy, for she was born in Florence, as her only sister, afterwards Lady Verney, was born in Naples, and in wanderings in many lands, she decided on her life work of nursing. She returned from her hard apprenticeship in many institutions, and especially in the Kaiserwert Institution on the Rhine, the first Protestant nursing home in Germany, to take the management of the sanatorium for sick ladies in Harley Street. In those days of our grandmothers, woman was still in the medieval state of development. She was a pretty ornament of the drawing-room, subject to all the proprieties expressed in prunes and prisms. She had no duty except the duty of being pretty and proper, no part in the work of the world except the task higher than that of seeing that her overlord's slippers were in the right place. The advent of Florence Nightingale into Harley Street was like a challenge to all that was feminine and early Victorian. A woman, a lady of birth and culture, as manager of an institution. The thing was impossible. The polite world thrilled with indignation at the outrage. It was related at the time — I quote from the yellow manuscript before me — that if she had forged a bill, or eloped, or betted her father's fortune away at Newmarket, she could not have provoked a more virulent hue and cry than she did by settling herself to a useful work. And it was not society alone that assailed her now and later. From the formalists at home, who were shocked at her handling keys and keeping accounts, to the jealous and quizzing doctors abroad, who would have suppressed her altogether, and the vulgar among the nurses, who whispered that she ate the jams and the jellies in a corner, she had all the hostility to encounter which the great may always expect from those who are too small to apprehend their mind and ways. But she had a dominating will and a dear purpose in all the acts of her life. She was indifferent to the judgment of the world. She saw the path and trod it with fearless steps wherever it led. Within her sphere she was an autocrat. Lord Stanmore, in his memoir of Sidney Herbert, the War Minister, whose letter inviting Miss Nightingale to go to the Crimea crossed her letter offering to go, has criticised her severe tongue and defiance of authority. But in the presence of the appalling problem of humanity that faced her and her band of 38 nurses, what were red tape and authority? As she passed down through these 4 miles of beds, 18 inches apart, each bearing its burden of pain and suffering, her passion of pity turned to a passion of indignation at the wanton neglect of the poor instruments of government, and she turned and rent the authors of the wrong. The hospital was chaos. There were neither hospital accessories, nor medical appliances, nor changes of clothing, nor proper food. It was a time for bitter speech and defiance of authority, and Florence Nightingale, her sight seared and her ears ringing with the infinite agony, thundered at the War Office until the crime was undone and her own powerful control was set up over all the hospitals of the East. And now the war is over. The long avenue of death and suffering that has been her home has vanished, and she sets sail for England. The world is ringing with her deeds. England awaits her with demonstrations of national gratitude unparalleled in history. She takes an assumed name, steals back by an unexpected route, and escapes, exhausted and unrecognised, to the peace of her father's house at Lea Hurst in the quiet valley of the Derwent. And when later the nation expresses its thanks by raising a fund of £50,000 for her benefit, she quietly hands it over to found the institution for training nurses at St. Thomas' Hospital, and with that act of radiant unselfishness she establishes the great modern movement of nursing. Mrs. Gamp flees for ever before the lady with the lamp. For Florence Nightingale is not a mere figure of romance. It is beautiful to think of the ministering angel moving with her lamp down the long lanes of pain at Scutari, to hear those pathetic stories of the devotion of the rough soldiers, all writing down her name as the name they loved, of the dying boy who wanted to see her pass because he could kiss her shadow as it moved across the pillow. But there have been many noble and self-sacrificing nurses, many who had as great a passion for suffering humanity as hers. To think of her only as a heroine in the romance of life is to mistake her place in history as well as to offend her deepest feelings. She is much more than a heroine of romance. She is the greatest woman of action this nation produced in the last century, perhaps the greatest woman of action this country has ever produced. She is the type of the pioneer, one of those rare personalities who reshape the contours of life. She was not simply the lady with the lamp. She was the lady with the brain and the tyrannic will, and in her we may discover the first clear promise of that woman's revolution which plays so large a part in the world today. The hand that smoothed the hot pillow of the sufferer was the same hand that rent the red tape and broke, defiant of officialism, the locked door to get at the bedding within. Nursing to her was not a pastime or an occupation. It was a revelation. The child whose dolls were always sick and being wooed back to life, who doctored the shepherd's dog in the valley of the Derwent and bound up her boy cousin's sudden wound, was born with the fever of revolution in her as truly as Danton or a Mazzini. She saw the world full of suffering, and beside the pillow, Ignorance and Sarah Gump. Her soul revolted against the grim spectacle, and she gave herself with single-eyed devotion to the task of reform. There is about her something of the sleepless fury of the fanatic, but she differs from the fanatic in this, that her mighty indignation is controlled by her powerful understanding and by her cold, almost icy, common sense. She has been the subject of more sentimental writing than any one of her time. But she is the least sentimental of women, and has probably dissolved fewer emotions in tears than any of her contemporaries. She has had something better to do with her emotions than waste them in easy lamentations. She has turned them to iron, and used them mercilessly to break down the stupidities that encompass the world of physical suffering, and to crush the opposition of ignorance and professional interest. All who have come in conflict with her have, like Sidney Herbert, had to bow to her despotic will, and today, old and lonely, forgotten by the great world that ebbs and flows by her home near Hyde Park Corner, she works with the same governed passion and concentration that she revealed in the great tragedy of 60 years ago. Truly seen, therefore, the Crimean episode is only an incident in her career. Her title to rank among the great figures of history would have been as unchallengeable without that tremendous chapter. For her work was not incidental, but fundamental; not passing, but permanent. She, too, divides the crown with old Timotheus. He raised a mortal to the skies. She brought an angel down. When good Pastor Fleidner, the head of the Kaiserswerth Institution, laid his hands at parting on her bowed head, she went forth to work a revolution, and today every nurse that sits through the dim hours by the restless bed of pain is in a real sense the gracious product of that revolution. She has made nursing a science. She has given it laws. She has revealed the psychology of suffering. How true, for example, is this? I have seen in fevers the most acute suffering produced from the patient in a hut not being able to see out of a window. I remember in my own case a nosegay of wild flowers being sent me, and from that moment recovery becoming more rapid. People say it is the effect on the patient's mind. It is no such thing. It is on the patient's body, too. Volumes are now written and spoken about the effect of the mind on the body. I wish more was thought of the effect of the body on the mind. She has moved mountains, but her ideal is still far off, for she wants not merely a profession of nurses, but a nation of nurses, every mother a health nurse, and every nurse an atom in the hierarchy of the ministers of the highest. It is a noble dream, and she has brought it within the grasp of the realities of that future which, as she says, I shall not see, for I am old. I put the yellow manuscript back into the envelope where it has lain for half a century. 1,600 articles did Harriet Martineau write for the Daily News. They are buried in the bound volumes of the issues of long ago. One still remains unpublished, the last word, happily, still unwritten. End of chapter 13.